We're so happy that so many people are here. I honestly was not sure how many people would show up given A, the Asian celebration, B, the weather, and C, the fact that although we think the show that we mounted upstairs is lovely, it's kind of a downer. So thank you for making time to come and spend and talk with us. So my name is Anne Rose Kitagawa. I'm the Chief Curator of Collections and Asian Art here at the JSMA. And I'm so pleased to not just be presenting by myself up here today. I'd like to introduce my co-presenter, Professor Tara Fickle from the English Department, a specialist amongst many other things in Asian American literature. Please. Thank you, Tara. So we're not exactly going to do a karaoke duet, but instead we're going to go through some of the background that will help people understand the special exhibition that we have mounted upstairs in the Barker Gallery, which is called Roger Shimomura, By Looking Back, We Look Forward. This is a show that we decided to do just as a passion project. It had a very short time frame, and we were helped in this by the fact that Jordan Schnitzer himself, in his private collection, has an astonishing group of works by Roger Shimomura, which form the core of this exhibition. Wanting to augment what he had with some of the more recent works that speak to current political situations, we were able to communicate with Roger Shimomura, the artist himself, and two of his gallerists, Sally Leedy, who is in Kansas City, and Greg Kucera, who is in Seattle. And the three of them conspired with us to present a small selection of some very topical, very powerful works that we're very proud to have on view upstairs. So, let's see, I can move with this. So first, a little bit about nomenclature.
Yeah, so we thought we'd just introduce a little bit of terminology we'll be using both throughout this presentation, and then also that'll hopefully help provide you. Oh, I should ask, can you all hear me okay? Great.
Good.
Oh, is the mic on?
Yeah. It is? Is there a way to make it louder, or are we?
I can just lean a little bit closer to it if, yeah? Can you hear that?
I can hear you. I think it's them.
I can hear you. I'm just wondering if the thing is on. I can hear myself, yes. So one of the things, right, so some terminology that'll also help kind of contextualize some of the works upstairs. So one of the ways in which we talk about terminology in Japanese American and also Asian American studies has to do with generational division. So we refer to the first generation Japanese Americans, which is to say the first generation immigrants or the first generation to come to America, as Issei. The second generation, or the first American born, we refer to them as Nisei. The third generation, Sansei, Yonsei, etc. So Shimomura himself is a Sansei, but part of the reason that the Issei-Nisei dyad is particularly important is because the intergenerational conflicts in camp, as we'll find out, ended up being a primary source of conflict that ended up having repercussions long after incarceration, partly because first-generation Japanese Americans, or Issei, could not be American citizens, right? They couldn't actually be naturalized. Any Japanese Americans could not be naturalized until 1952. And so that means that Nisei, or American-born citizens, often acted in more ways than one as proxies, legal proxies, as well as translator proxies, et cetera, for their parents. They were American citizens, of course, according to the 14th Amendment, the Birthright Amendment. But the government often exploited some of those intergenerational conflicts in camp itself. So we thought it would be useful to have you just get a sense of the terminological differences. The other terminology that we're going to be using today is the term concentration camps, American concentration camps. And this has been a shift, over the last decade or so, particularly in both scholarly and activist work. And first of all, it's important to say that the use of the term concentration camps is in no way meant to diminish the experience of the Holocaust, but rather, first of all, in terms of just historical fidelity, that the term concentration camps is one that FDR himself used when first talking about the plan to, quote unquote, relocate or evacuate Japanese Americans to a number of camps in the interior. Rather, though, that kind of euphemism and the role of euphemism in silencing a lot of what has happened since, both within Japanese American communities and outside of it, is why we'll be talking about Japanese American incarceration rather than internment, and why we'll be talking about American concentration camps.
So I should explain a little bit about the title of the exhibition. So the title of the exhibition, by looking back, we look forward, is drawn from this. This is, in some ways, the saddest thing that I own. So this is a yearbook from Minidoka, from the internment camp. It was actually produced by the incarcerees in the camp. In late 1943, they started production. It was produced in 1944, and they didn't have enough for everybody who wanted them. But it is a very patriotic, very sad document that shows what life was like in the camps, although a somewhat censored view. In the preface, it has a last paragraph that says what you see on the screen there, which to me is many years earlier, kind of the I have a dream speech for these particular individuals.
Yeah, one of the things that's really striking about this yearbook, and if I'm not mistaken, there's a copy of it upstairs on one of the sofas that I encourage you to look through. It's a really amazing and fascinating document. We only wanted to highlight just a couple of images here. So it's a very large camp, as you can see, but there were certain pages dedicated to, affiliations, organizations. And one of the striking things to me upon first discovering this was the way in which the kind of Americanization and the desire to represent the actual experience, the lived experience of Japanese Americans in camp who understood themselves to be Americans, who were in the Boy Scouts or the Girl Scouts. The reason that we included this image on the right here, which is a page from this infamous loyalty questionnaire that was distributed to all Japanese Americans 17 and older in order to gain a significant amount of information that might be able to, in the War Relocation Authority's mind, establish the loyalty of Japanese Americans and separate the loyals from the disloyals. And what's interesting, and you can find copies of this online if you're interested in looking at the specific questions, is that it asks things like these two particular ones. Before I actually even get there, I was just going to say that some of the questions are quite invasive, asking about what is your role in organizations, what magazines do you subscribe to, what where do you have bank accounts, et cetera. And the way that those were scored, as we found out later, had to do with these ideas of what organizations were considered more American, what sports or hobbies. So if you were in the Boy Scouts, that's a +1, right? If you were, let's say, a member of a Shinto or a Buddhist church, that's a -1, right? And so the ways in which these actual ideas about loyalty were scored is something that I think is interesting to see in the narrative. Do you want to go to the next one?
Sure. So the loyalty questionnaire had two particularly infamous questions, questions 27 and 28, which you see here in full. These caused great tensions amongst the Japanese Americans of the second generation, the Nisei. Are you willing to serve in the armed forces of the United States on combat duty, wherever ordered? Many of them were. However, when your entire family has been incarcerated by your government, this kind of seems like a trick question. And it also seems like you're volunteering for the draft by your answer with this. So this caused a great deal of tension within the community. Even more so, will you swear unqualified allegiance to the United States from any and all attacks by foreign and domestic forces, and forswear any form of allegiance or obedience to the Japanese emperor, to any other foreign government, power, or organization? Total trick question. How do you answer that? If you say yes, it actually presupposes that you had allegiance to the Japanese emperor. So people were completely confused as, how am I supposed to answer this? And again, there were people who said no to those two questions, and those people became known as no-nos. John Okada wrote a book that we'll see the cover of later called No Boy, and it is in particular in relation to these two questions.
Can I also add something?
Sure.
The other thing, too, is that originally, actually, this questionnaire was developed in order to facilitate the reinstatement of the draft within camp, specifically for Nisei men. But they also then adapted it, which was problematic, for first women, so that the question 27 said something like, are you willing to serve in the armed forces, or something like the Army Corps of Nurses? So forcing that answer as well. But then secondly, it became distributed to Issei as well. And so you can imagine that question number 28 being particularly fraught for someone who doesn't have any recourse to American citizenship. So in other words, to agree to forswear any form of allegiance or obedience or to any other foreign government, which is to say your Japanese citizenship, saying yes is going to essentially render you a stateless person, right? No protection from any foreign government. So the division in camp, but also within even individual families between those who answered some yes, some no, and were actually subsequently segregated to different camps, is why this particular questionnaire was so explosive.
So what we see here is an image of the residents of Block 6, including Roger Shimomura, which I valiantly tried but kind of failed to enlarge here on the left. He's at the very far left of the large photo in his little overalls.
Oh yeah, one of the other things, there are so many interesting things in this yearbook. I do hope you go take a look, but to the extent that it was a yearbook very much of its time, this particular, was this 43?
This is for
and the idea that, you know, one of the pages has to do with the election of a kind of beauty queen. And what's interesting, I think, as you'll note here, is the way in which the many Japanese Americans, many Nisei and the very young Sansei, understood themselves to be Americans, right? They didn't speak Japanese, they didn't read Japanese, certainly not fluently enough to be the kind of disloyals that, you know, the American government would brand them as. But there was also an idea about the way that they might conform to, let's say, American beauty standards, and the way that they understood Japanese American femininity at that time. So the gender relationships within camp are of particular interest kind of as they're displayed through this yearbook.
And we won't belabor it, but if you read the text, it is deeply creepy.
Mm-hmm.
So let's talk a little bit about Roger Shimomura, speaking of beautiful beauty ideals. So Roger Shimomura was born in 1939 in Seattle, and he had the misfortune, along with everyone else who was Japanese or Japanese American, to be evacuated from the West Coast and sent to internment camps. And they lived out the war in the camp. They moved to Chicago. They eventually resettled in Seattle, where he went to school at the University of Washington, studying art. But actually, do you want to tell the story about his? So he ended up going through the ROTC and doing military service, about which he was hugely conflicted. His parents wanted him badly to become, does this sound familiar? Kind of a doctor, become a doctor, be a lawyer. He was told he should become a doctor or a dentist, but if he wasn't going to do that, he should go into the military. And in fact, the parents pulled out all the stops and had a decorated military hero from World War II, another Nisei, Japanese American, come and speak to him and persuaded him to enter the ROTC. So he served in the Army for a short time in the United States and in Korea, and then went back to art school, studied art, and then ended up at Syracuse doing not just painting, but also performance and film, and eventually ended up as a professor at the University of Kansas, from which he retired in 2004 after 35 years. So he is a pop artist. When he was at Syracuse, pop art was all the rage in New York. And he was so taken by it. And in particular, he loved the way that the images grab you through color and graphic design. But there was a pervasive sense that it was kind of cool and detached. And he made it his effort to make it hot and relevant. And so what he starts to do is juxtapose well-worn pop images, in this case invoking Andy Warhol's images of Marilyn Monroe, and also things like the Brillo boxes. We actually have one of those upstairs in our South Upper Hall. Objects of daily life. The pop artists were kind of a reaction against abstract expressionists who were much more about process and the way that things looked, less about iconography. And the pop artists came up with these splashy things drawn from popular culture, from comic books, from Hollywood, from objects of daily life that one could purchase. And so Shimomura sort of inserts things like, I think we're supposed to think of Ritz crackers on the left, but on the right he has Moto-chan ramen. So there's a sort of duality. What is American? What is Japanese? He also ends up drawing on ukiyo-e images, that is, images from the so-called floating world, or ukiyo. This is an art form that came about in the Edo period in Japan and is kind of different from practically all of the other art that you see before the 20th century in art museums, in that it was pop art at the time. It was about kabuki actors, sumo wrestlers, beautiful women in the pleasure quarter. It definitely had sort of social class associations. It was not the art of the upper classes. These were multiples. These were prints that were made, sold on the street for about the price of a bowl of noodles, and it put within the grasp of normal people, not just the court or the samurai, but townsmen, images of their idols, their pop idols. So Shimomura starts playing with ukiyo-e imagery and pop art and finding different ways to juxtapose them in order to kind of question and provoke. And humor is often an aspect of his art. So here he's used one of the common tropes that you see in ukiyo-e, that is a beautiful woman looking into a mirror, which affords the viewer a chance to see not just her lovely face, but also the back of her neck, which is considered to be particularly alluring for traditional Japanese men. But what does she see in the mirror? Lo and behold, she is Elizabeth Taylor or Marilyn Monroe. He also is very playful in his associations, and I think upstairs I have a label that explains a little bit about where some of the specific imagery is coming from. So this Enter the Rice Cooker is a large-scale silkscreen print in which he's juxtaposed an image of a kabuki actor who is the hero of a play, who is seen rushing onto the stage to save the day, usually carrying a sword, in this case, carrying a rice cooker. And the beautiful woman who you see in the background in silhouette. And if you think back to the ukiyo-e, many things are seen kind of through a scrim, through different screens or curtains. That is something that he plays with here, but here she's not a courtesan from the pleasure district during the Edo period, she's a World War II pinup. The name itself, I urge you to look at Shimomura's object names upstairs. They are almost always funny or pointed. In this case, Enter the Rice Cooker, clearly invoking Bruce Lee's film, Enter the Dragon. So.
And one other thing, as you said that, no, was just the emphasis that those kind of screens are really interesting, really redeployed in his incarceration. Painting, so thinking how that grid and that wall works, and you'll see images of it later. So one of the things that's so great about a presentation like this is that we can have you kind of look at multiple different ways in which the influences on Shimomura are evident, some of them from Japanese art, but also we wanted to situate it within a number of American contexts, both art, but then also the history of it. So Japanese Americans, of course, were one among many Asian immigrant groups who followed a similar pattern of being of coming over themselves or being brought in as cheap or in some cases indentured labor, followed by patterns of exclusion. So here we just wanted to highlight the emphasis that this is a pattern that had been followed and would continue with Chinese American laborers both in Hawaii and then also on the West Coast in gold mines, in plantations, sugarcane fields, and the railroad, Filipino immigrants, Punjabi, especially Punjabi Sikh, Korean laborers, et cetera. So that this is in a larger context, but one in which, in particular, I think we're about to look at soon, are associated with a particular set of images that also really influence Shimomura. One of those being, of course, Pearl Harbor. And this is one of those that, Japanese Americans that lived through the incarceration always mark, as all Americans do who are living through that point, of Pearl Harbor is the moment at which things really changed for Japanese Americans, especially in the States, and the moment at which it no longer mattered whether you were American or Japanese, but this conflation and the idea that you suddenly looked like the enemy. So it's something that Shimomura dramatizes in particular.
He also has a penchant for really eloquently quoting earlier works of art. So what you see on the right is a heartbreaking photo by Dorothea Lange, taken the day after Pearl Harbor, of a storefront in Los Angeles, where the owner has put up a huge sign in bold letters saying, "I am an American." And Shimomura has used that beautiful car in front of it in the work of art upstairs that just chills me to my bones. Looking out from the internment camp barrack across the barbed wire to the back of that beautiful car, you probably can't see from where you are, but the license plate says 9066. That is the evacuation order number that President Roosevelt signed. So he hides code in his works of art, but not so deeply that you can't find it. Likewise, he has utilized actually pre-war imagery, such as this shocking image of someone standing on their porch in Hollywood in the 1920s. And he has used it in a way to speak about what it was like to come back to communities after the war. So he's made her a sort of cheeky World War II silhouette, but even so, I think the message stands. So I wanted to put a few slides up to just sort of speak to the fact that authorities were not in any way muting their words. It was quite clear to the people in power that these Japanese Americans, whether born in the United States or born overseas and denied the option of becoming American citizens, were a danger. And they harnessed that fear that people had, which actually served multiple purposes. There were plenty of farmers along the West Coast who had relegated Japanese farmers to very small plots of not the most desirable land, and through hard work, a number of those farmers had done very well. And so there was already a great deal of anti-Japanese animosity on the West Coast, and Pearl Harbor made it possible for people to realize their hopes of, let's just get rid of these people once and for all.
Yeah. Something else interesting, too, about some of this logic is that it was used to set up a counterpart such that there were some branches of government that suggested that incarcerating Japanese Americans, they could later be used as basically trades for American soldiers that were prisoners of war in Asia, right? Considering them essentially enemy combatants rather than civilians. And, you know, most of whom, again, as we said, the Nisei and Sansei had never been to Japan, right? They may have had their births registered as dual citizens, which was quite common at the time. But certainly didn't have the kind of connection that was imagined. Also, to speak to that kind of racial exceptionalism, the idea that Japanese were particularly skillful farmers in agriculture, especially truck farming and small produce along the West Coast, was in a very perverse kind of turn used in propaganda films to suggest that Japanese were being sent out to, quote, make the desert bloom, right? The idea that they would actually be able to turn the desert, as we'll see, where most of these incarceration camps were, most of these concentration camps were, that they would actually be there in a kind of weird reverse manifest destiny to instead, you know, make it bloom. So the numbers vary, 112, 117, 120, 122,000 people. I think it really depends on which camps you're counting, and because there were camps beyond the 10 that we will list, in which people who were really thought to be spies were incarcerated. So this gives you some of the statistics. 2/3 American citizens, nearly 1/3 children. This is a sign. This was the one that was actually shown in Los Angeles. We have one upstairs that was shown in Oregon that alerted people that they were going to be rounded up and sent away. And in some cases, people had 2 days. Some people had 6 days to put their worldly goods in order. That means usually selling them at liquidation sale prices or giving them away and hoping that people would take care of them, assuming they ever came back from wherever they were going, which they didn't know where they were going. And they were put onto different forms of transportation, trains, buses, and sent first to assembly centers. There are lots of euphemistic terms here, such as this, Santa Anita Racetrack, where families lived in the stalls that were designed for horses. And if those images at the top right, too, you know, bear a really chilling familiarity to other images that you've seen, of the Holocaust resident Jews being put on a train to camps, that actually is not coincidental. In fact, if you look at the literature from this time, of which, you know, many Japanese Americans remained reticent about, but a number of them did eventually write about, there was a very real fear in these camps that they did not know what was going to happen to them. And the fear of liquidation was actually a very real one, and not until, you know, now we look in retrospect and realize that that wasn't the outcome, but for them, going in, there wasn't really any clear sense. So this is the sign that is on view upstairs that lists the different counties and the fact that anyone lying west of Highway 97 needed to get away. The civil control station was located right about where the Holt Center is, and so many of you will know there is a memorial there, the Japanese American Memorial, that kind of commemorates this. There are also a great number of pop cultural images that invoked terrible ideas, terrible stereotypes. And
Shocking to some, Superman was part of the war effort. Superman says you can slap a Jap with war bonds and stamps. Likewise, Dr. Seuss, whom I otherwise adore, was also part of the propaganda against the Japanese, and this is just one of hundreds of editorial cartoons that he produced. This one from February 13th, 1942.
And also, something I always sort of tell my students when I'm showing some of these is to give you a sense of some of the imagery that would have been circulated and seen by Japanese Americans, especially Japanese American children, who were, often, I think, thinking of Superman as a kind of all-American hero, as Shimomura later actually represents himself in. But particularly with Dr. Seuss, who they're still familiar with, some of this imagery here, as you can see at the top, it says waiting for the signal from home. So the idea here is that Japanese Americans are part of a quote-unquote fifth column. In other words, enemies within who are waiting to be kind of activated as terrorist cells, who will then do things like commit domestic terrorist acts. Here they're being handed TNT to blow up the bridge, compromise military operations, et cetera. So this is, of course, one of the logics for why they had to be, quote unquote, evacuated away from the coast, which would be a sensitive military area.
So I think I lost one image in here, for which I apologize. However, Roger Shimomura has a personal collection of deleterious stereotypes of Asian peoples. And what you see on the upper left is a selection of the masks that he owns. He also has lots of salt and pepper shakers and other items that have, of course, grotesque stereotypes, today things we would not be proud of. And he uses those as the source material for a lot of his own works, which is the rest of what you see on the screen, including American, in which he himself is the person who is vanquishing the Japs, different citizens, and then at the lower left, Yellow Terror, with himself in the center, pulling his eyes back, and 83 Dirty Japs, with, again, himself in the center. I also threw this in because this is something that I think may not be obvious to everyone, but anybody who's grown up Asian American in the United States might recognize some of the idea of being a banana that is yellow on the outside, white on the inside, or whitewashing, how you're a target, or you might be equated with someone who is an enemy during wartime. And he plays with grotesque stereotypes in a number of the works that we have upstairs. So this is a series called Mix and Match, in which he has couples of mixed race. And it was interesting to me to look at his portrayal of Japanese women is always exotic and desirable, whereas men are not, decidedly so. However, even the idea of being desirable, I think here, is a horrible idea, because it seems to me that the woman on the picture on the left is actually naked. And so that makes a very unequal relationship there, and it's suggestive in ways that he's never really explicitly spoken about, but it makes sure that everybody feels rotten about these relationships. We were lucky enough that Jordan Schnitzer also very graciously allowed us to show some works that would be material that Shimomura himself would be quoting. So we have this fabulous Warhol upstairs that is a screen print that has diamond dust on it. It sparkles. And we juxtapose that with some of Shimomura's images of superheroes. Because again, as a pop artist, he's interested in all those pop cultural icons. But here he has put his own face on the body of Superman. What does it mean if Superman was Japanese American? Likewise, Wonder Woman here, he portrays not just a 1970s version of Wonder Woman, but samurai hands holding a sword, his mother, and a little animated character from Korea called Puka flying through the air above the barracks. And one of the signature images from the show, American versus Japanese. This is from his American knockoff series, in which he portrays himself in many different ways, in this case as the single American masked against all of these Japanese samurai, sumo wrestlers, kabuki actors, but still playing at tropes as if he were a martial arts expert, which he is not. And he is Superman.
One of the things that we wanted to talk about, too, to kind of bring us back to the historical context of the incarceration, is to kind of show this was an editorial cartoon, and as you can see, it's someone who's taken over a previously Japanese-owned business, right, and it's crossed out, and it says, "Let's keep America for Americans," is in 1945. And the caption says, "No, we don't have to worry about the owner coming back. He was killed in Italy." And we'll be talking more about what the role of the segregated Japanese American all Nisei unit, the 442nd, the role that they played later on. But just to say that there were also images circulating that were very critical of American compliance, or in some cases, active benefiting from the incarceration of Japanese.
So we have put a few classic images here so that you can see what, for example, Dorothea Lange was doing. And I must say, Dorothea Lange and Ansel Adams come out as great heroes to me from this project, in the sense that in the same way that Lange was able to make heroic the struggles of regular Americans during the Dust Bowl, she likewise turned her camera and looked at very hard truths that were going on with the evacuation. And I think the fact that you have people tagged like luggage was something that she very much wanted to forefront, how dehumanizing that was for adults and for children. Shimomura's experience of the camp was something, it was through the eyes of a child. He was only 3 when he went. And so when he's asked about it, he says, people always ask, but I kind of liked it. My friends were all there. I had a chance to play with them all the time. Otherwise, I would only see them on special holidays. Even so, it was a twisted environment in which a child could grow up. I mean, we see lots of children now who are interested in toy guns and things, but I think it's very different when they're real guns and they're pointed at you.
I think the point of this one was to, this is an image you may be familiar with, but to kind of show the maps of where these concentration camps were. As you can probably tell, there's a line here right along the West Coast, which is bisecting in some cases, one city or even one side of a city from the other, such that everyone who was living west of this line had to be, quote, evacuated, and everybody east of the line could stay. Of course, at some point they closed the line so that there was no movement across it allowed anymore. Many of these camps, as you can tell, are located in very harsh conditions. We'll see some images later of what that looked like on the ground. But in particular, interestingly, some of these areas were camps on land that were purchased or leased, actually, from Native Americans. Land to which they had been pushed initially and now were leasing. And it's interesting, too, the way that the Arkansas camps work that way. But as you can see, a lot of it in eastern California and then in the southwest here were areas that were not only very not arable in terms of agriculture, but also extreme heat and cold throughout those years.
And I think I should mention that I took these statistics from one source, and this predates the time when the second camp, Tule Lake, became the high security camp in which a lot of the no-nos were incarcerated, at which point its numbers ballooned up to 33,000 as they prepared to deport people who answered wrong on those questions.
And also that Minidoka, as you can see in Idaho, in southeast Idaho there, that would have been the primary destination for people living in Oregon and then also in Seattle, like Shimomura.
So this is Minidoka, 2 views, and they started peopling it from Barrack 1 through Barrack 45, ending up with about 9,000 and change in terms of people there. The Shimomuras lived, I believe, in Block 6. These are views of the camps during hot and cold times and rainy times. The camps had hastily built barracks, really no privacy whatsoever. Not just shared walls, but in some cases the walls didn't go all the way up to the ceiling, so everyone could hear everyone else's business. Not particularly sealed from the elements, very dusty during dust storms, and as you can see, it's a sloppy mess when it's raining, so not ideal situations. Sorry.
Oh, no, not at all. I think maybe you'll talk about this a little more, so I'll just briefly mention that, of course, these images that we get here are mostly from government-approved publications, and so they don't even quite capture the extent of what you hear later. Many of the people that were incarcerated were city people, right? Particularly from Southern California, Los Angeles. There are interviews where they say, we didn't even own windbreakers, and then we were sent here to places where we were so cold that we had to order all of our material from the Sears Roebuck catalogs that would come through instead. The fact that we had brought sunglasses because we thought it might be sunny, but in fact it ended up being our only protection from the kind of flying dust and pebbles that were here. So it was a sort of an active struggle to survive in a really real way.
So Shimomura's imagery starts, well, it vacillates. There are things that are more recent images where he uses camps as a metaphor, but there are some very literal things through the eyes of a child that are quite documentary. And in this case, the image that we used at the entrance to the exhibition is called American Alien 3, again, thinking about those titles, where he portrays himself as a small boy and his mother in the doorway, a sort of nocturnal scene looking into their barrack. You can't really see on the screen, but with the actual painting, you'll see that there is barbed wire against the night sky out the window. And it's a very effective way in which he's able to use silhouette and shadow in a number of his images. In some cases, it kind of isolates a figure, often his figure, and leaves you wondering, what was he feeling? What was he thinking? He uses it in different ways in different images. Again, documentary images showing enemies and enemies too, himself with his mother above, himself with his grandmother below, and that ubiquitous barbed wire that we see everywhere in so many of his images. But still, besides the barbed wire, seems like a relatively neutral or happy image of a childhood.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of incarcerees, too, who were children speak to the total breakdown of the family unit that often happened in camp. So children were eating alone, apart from their parents, and rather with their friends, and often kind of running around. School was not very much in session. There was very little resources, and they were expected to kind of serve as their own teachers. So the way that ended up having an effect down the line is that there were much more ranks kind of closed around generational lines.
One of the other tools that we have upstairs for people to kind of enter into the world of the show is a recently published graphic novel that actually documents George Takei of Star Trek fame, his experience at Rower, Arkansas. And again, through the eyes of a child, but a very effective book in the sense that it ends up portraying in real time in a very human scale the sort of constitutional issues that were at play there. There's a lot of art that was actually produced during the internment in different camps, some of them by known entities and some not. So up above is an absolutely beautiful depiction of Heart Mountain in Wyoming by an anonymous artist, carved wood. It was actually a door frame. And beneath is a work of art that we just welcomed into our collection by Takuichi Fuji, who was a Japanese artist who had been living in Seattle, was interned at Minidoka, and this is one of umpteen different watercolors he did of that Minidoka experience.
Oh, and then another representation, as I mentioned before, literature was, for obvious reasons, censored greatly coming out of the camps. But even so, after the camps, we actually have a relatively small number of literary works. There are some poems that were later published, but this work, No No Boy, is a novel that was written by John Okada. It was published in 1957, and it was one of the first not only about incarceration and the very painful and unwelcoming response that many Japanese Americans got when returning to their homes after camp, but also probably one of the first that was really angry about that. And the idea of a Japanese American that was sort of angry rather than sort of silent, because there was so much silence about it afterwards, sort of took people by surprise. The first edition actually didn't sell out for quite some time, and interestingly, the very audience that it was intended for, in other words, Japanese Americans on the West Coast who had been incarcerated, were those for whom it became kind of the most taboo subject at all. So the first run, in fact, actually was in Japan. And you may recognize this book recently, too. There was a Penguin controversy over it that's been covered in the media somewhat, in which Penguin Books released a series of Asian American classics, one of these being it, but without the permission of a royalty given to Okada's family. And after quite a bit of controversy around that, they pulled the books from the shelves, and the University of Washington Press one is the most current.
So just a note to all of us in the Pacific Northwest, John Okada is actually the brother of the artist Frank Okada, whose work you'll see in our collection and in others, a very gifted Pacific Northwest artist who is doing very interesting color studies. If you go to the Japanese American Memorial, you'll see a square beneath that just says, Frank Okada, Art, Food, Jazz.
And I think we just wanted to provide one other example of some graphic fiction. This was a graphic novel produced by Minokubo, Citizen 13660, in reference to the numbers. that she wore. And also just to give you kind of a comparison, I think it's an interesting counterpart to Shimomura's work. This is somebody who came in as a young adult and an artist, and it's a very different perspective, and it reminds us too about what Shimomura maybe couldn't see, and the way that he's kind of reproducing the feelings as much as the facts and the memories that he may have of camp.
So we thought we would unpack a couple of works that Shimomura produced that are on view upstairs in the show, such as this really beautiful Mistaken Identities suite. So this has 6 individual prints, and each one of them has a title for someone. So for Tokyo Ueyama, for Ansel Adams, for Masao Mori, for Seattle PI, for the Hatate family, and for Dorothea Lange. So these images reference specific source material. In the case of Tokyo Ueyama, he actually was looking at a painting by Ueyama of Ueyama's wife, Suye, who was here, the evacuee, in a watercolor that was produced at Topaz in 1942. Here cast in the guise of a beautiful Harunobu beauty. The fact that he uses ukiyo-e tropes in order to portray this at one hand seems charming, but on the other hand, he's actually making the point that these people were viewed as being foreign, even though they were American citizens. So it is a very pointed humor. Likewise, Ansel Adams, another great hero, self-produced a book called Born Free and Equal, the story of loyal Japanese Americans in 1944, for which he was vilified. It shows normal people going about their business in Manzanar. And I think it is for that reason, and probably that particular image, that Shimomura is referencing in this beautiful for Ansel Adams. One of the earliest pictures of the evacuation, done by a photographer whose name we don't know, of a mother and child whose names we do know, being evacuated from Bainbridge Island, the first place that was evacuated along the west coast on March 30th, 1942, which she's then cast in the guise of an utomato mother and child, but very pointedly with that tag. And last but not least, the image in honor of Dorothea Lange, in which I think he must have been looking at the Mochida family images and making the little girl into a little Japanese girl, wearing a kimono, but also wearing that tag. So one of the other very effective tropes that, and I must say, I'm torn. I'm a Japanese art historian. I'm not a specialist in American art. So his art gets me where it counts. He used this trope. This is a type of screen that are called dakuchu dakugaizu, or images of in and around Kyoto. And this one is in our collection. It's on view upstairs as kind of comparative material to the Shimomura show. And it has this beautiful bird's eye view, perspective of various landmarks of the city and people going about their business. And I mean, it's the celebration of a particular place and time. Shimomura uses this trope in the most dastardly way, just by inserting the silhouette of the guard at the top of the tower whose view it is. All of a sudden, the viewer is co-opted. You are part of that surveillance. And he's not subtle. The gun of that guard is pointing down to the silhouette of Shimomura as a little boy on his tricycle. And there's another guard tower in the distance. So the golden clouds that you see in these screens, the perspective completely warped to a terrible vision. And he's done it again in a larger painting upstairs in the centerpiece of the gallery, which is a little bit more like the rakuchu rakugaizu in the sense that you have people going about their business. And he's really emphasized these are normal people, old, young, people of different professions going about their business. And deep in that little recess between two barracks is in shadow that little boy on a bicycle. He is, let me see, I think I even have a pointer on this thing, maybe right there. You'll have to go and look at the actual painting to make it out, but it is there, I promise. So.
Let's see. Try to get through this somewhat quickly. One thing that we just wanted to emphasize is the 442nd. So those Nisei, which is, say, second generation, both on the West Coast and in Hawaii, made up a segregated unit called the 442nd, which was and continues to be the most decorated unit in the American military in terms of both honors and casualties. And so this image on the right here, the JACL, United We Stand, that's a reference to the Japanese American Citizens League, which just to reference the intergenerational conflicts that we spoke about earlier, the Japanese American Citizen League was one of the groups that advocated most for compliance, both with the original forced removal and then secondarily with answering yes on the loyalty questionnaire. And so that was sort of where those lines tended to be drawn among those who were drafted or who were part of the JACL, and those Issei and other resistors, draft resistors and no-no boys.
So again, when you look at the titles of Shimomura's art, American Soldier, that might not be the picture that people would immediately expect, but it's very pointed, what is patriotism? The little seal that you see beneath with the hand from the Statue of Liberty was worn on the hats of the people from the 442nd, and will figure in a later slide. So what does Shimomura do? He uses his pop art style with its flat color. He finds personal iconography. He starts juxtaposing them in very interesting ways. And so this is an interior barrack view that has on the right side irises drawn from Edo period Rimpa paintings, very beautiful things, probably no irises in the barracks at Minidoka. On the left, you have an image taken directly from Roy Lichtenstein, his pistol, which was first a huge banner and then made as different posters. On the upper right, you've got the distant view out the window of the tops of other barracks. And up on the left, I think, is Shimomura's kind of quirky fun, Hunt's tomato ketchup, probably standing in for the fact that Minidoka was in Hunt, Idaho. And so the show rounds out with a number of works that use Minidoka as a lens through which to look at more recent American history. And this is a series of 8 works from a much larger body. I think I'd already shown you the Fleetwood with the car, but utilizing World War II imagery to speak towards the present. You'll see Shimomura himself in uniform in a work called Lieutenant inside of the barracks with our current president outside. And at the lower right, you'll see an image of a barracks eye view of September 11th, manifesting that great fear that so many Japanese Americans had when September 11th happened of like, oh no, don't let them do this to another group of people. The show ends with his most recent body of works, 2018 through 2019. I think he's still making this series, Muslims and More, in which it has truly become a metaphor. He's using barbed wire and surveillance and a lot of the imagery that he has consistently used in the past, but juxtaposing it with things having to do with the border wall with Mexico, the treatment of women, the treatment of Muslims, provocative images filled with personal imagery that unfortunately might still be universal. So as we had mentioned, the JACL, Japanese American Citizens League, was very much upset about what happened, first at September 11th and more recently with all sorts of rules that are being put up, Muslim countries, bans, and made very explicit reference to it in their own material. And these are some of the more recent things that they have been talking about, as recently as the 12th of February. Wash your hands and don't be racist, talking about the coronavirus. So there are lots of ways in which Shimomura's art is all too relevant today. And we thought we might end just saying that there are other things that are going to be happening around campus. At 2 p.m., the Japanese American Association of Lane County will be taking a tour of the Shimomura show at 2 p.m. Would you like to speak at all about David Mura coming at 4:30 the same day?
Oh yeah, absolutely. David Mura is probably one of the most well-known, also I believe a Sansei poet who will be coming to give a talk and a reading, I think partly from his most recent work. But is that also on February 19th at 4:30 in the night browsing room across the quad?
So the image that you see on the left is actually the symbol of redress. Redress came very late, too late for most of the people who were interned, but eventually the United States government did formally apologize and gave redress to the living survivors of the camps. And February 19th is the day that people, you won't say celebrate, but at least remember. That is the this next Wednesday will be the 78th anniversary of the date on which Roosevelt signed the executive order.
Yeah, it's a perfect place to kind of end here and go upstairs because Shimomura has very explicitly emphasized the goal of his work as being to refuse to let people forget.
Right. He characterizes himself as, he says, there are some Japanese and Japanese American artists that use traditional art in a way that is beautiful and evocative. I don't do that. I'm, as a friend said to me, a stick in the eye. Don't forget. Don't forget. And so with that, we'd like to welcome you upstairs, unless you have questions down here.
How was food provided, or what was the situation in terms of what people could eat in the time?
So let me see if I can go back to a slide that actually, so the question is, how was food provided in the camps? And there were barracks in which people lived, and in between the barracks there were sort of mess halls. And the food, I think that what you're seeing in the center of this Heart Mountain thing is supposed to be the mess hall, because it looks different, it's larger than, has multiple doors, and it sounds like the food was not great. Although many of and you'll see in the book upstairs, there were many people who were pressed into service to grow food, vegetables, animals, and they were supplying food for inside the camp as well as for people outside. And at times of particular need, because it was the war, some of the internees were actually trucked outside of the camps in order to help other farmers with their businesses.
It's a great question, too, just briefly, that technically, the way that War Relocation Authority propaganda films came out, of which there were quite a few, justifying the incarceration, suggested that food would not only be healthful, but would also be tailored to the particular taste, let's say, of Issei. So there'd be Japanese food available, and also, American food available for the Nisei. One of the most striking points of resistance came from one of the camps in which there was news that the army was actually withholding certain black market goods, so sugar, right? So they would be allowed a certain, they had been rationed a certain inventory of sugar that was continually being withheld from the camps. And so fights between the incarcerees, who then began to organize themselves very strongly, often actually started to explode around food.
I know it's a cheerful show, I'm sorry. So with that, we'll be happy to answer any questions you might have upstairs. Thank you.